what that highlights is that where we're at the moment is in the middle of some giant AI experiment.
And I'm looking at where we are with generative AI. I don't want us to wait 15 years before we go, you know what, this stuff is actually pretty harmful.
This government and the last government, but particularly this government, have drunk the Kool-Aid, I think it's fair to say, when it comes to technology and AI. Should we be concerned?
For today's Broken Custodians, we are joined by Tom Richmond. Welcome, Tom. Tom has spent his entire career in the education system, both as a teacher on the front line in a state secondary and a sixth form, and thinking about policy issues, both while working in think tanks and as an advisor to the Department for Education. Tom's also got a podcast called Inside Your Ed, which we can recommend for all things education. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you for having me.
I should say that we were sort of introduced to each other, weren't we, when I think by virtue of a very powerful paper that you wrote specifically about AI in education and potential concerns. And I think it's fair to say that goes against the grain of some current thinking on AI, because you know, this government and the last government, but particularly this government, have drunk the Kool-Aid, I think it's fair to say, when it comes to technology and AI. And I suppose the first question is, you know, on a very broad general level, should we be concerned? You know, isn't AI next best thing since sliced bread? Shouldn't we all be lapping it up? You know, this power to transform humanity and education and industry. Or is it a little bit more nuanced than that?
A lot more nuanced. It's quite common for a prime minister to talk about education. It's quite common for a prime minister to talk about technology, for example. But it is quite unusual for a prime minister to get involved in discussions about educational technology. Education technology has been around for as long as personal computers have been around. Artificial intelligence in one form or another has been around for 50 years, from what experts tell me. So there's something that's definitely changed here. It's quite clear that the Prime Minister and the Department for Education see something in the power of generative AI particularly, and they're very, very keen to promote them to schools, to colleges, to the people running those institutions. And that really caught my eye because it's come quite quickly, and we know this technology is still, in the historical terms, is incredibly new. And yet the government clearly feels that this is something that they should be actively getting involved in conversations about this and pushing this technology onto schools and colleges. And that really got me thinking last year, well, what do we know about the impact of these technologies? It's, of course, completely fine for a government to say, we think the direction of travel should be X or Y. That happens all the time. But I thought when it comes to things being in schools, in colleges, in classrooms, we really should be very careful about where we place our bets. And what we try and prioritize and maybe deprioritize. And I think that's what got me most interested in this. Do we really have the answers to these quite fundamental questions?
Not everyone will be aware of how embedded this technology, and I think in particular AI, but more generally EdTech, is now in schools. Ben and I come at this from the point of view more as parents. So we are living this with our own children now, and parents are telling us, and we see with our own eyes, that there's a lot of tech and there's a lot of concerns about the use of that tech. But as an educator, is that your experience too? Like, is tech as everywhere as certainly our impression is?
Well, I think this is one of the things that has really changed. When it came to education technology in the past, a school would be buying a product. It was a very clearly labeled product. They would use it or they would not use it. Another school would buy a different product and they would use it or not use it. But I think what we're seeing with generative AI in particular is that these products are being infused into other things in a way that makes them very hard to see them as something separate now. So if you ask people, do you use AI in your daily work? Some people will say yes and some people will say no. But the reality is that more and more of what we use is being powered by AI, even if we don't realize it. Microsoft's Copilot software, for example, they are now, or a tool perhaps I should describe it as, you go and use a Microsoft product now, it is almost impossible not to use some form of artificial intelligence within that when you're doing PowerPoint slides. Even in Microsoft Word, it's starting to get a bit more AI power in there. Google Classroom has been in our schools for many, many years. It's not a new product, but Google's Gemini chatbot and their artificial intelligence technology, that's now being infused into these existing products. So when you ask teachers or even pupils, are you using AI? It's actually becoming very hard to answer that question. So when we're thinking about what impact these technologies have on children, on young people, on teachers, it's getting very, very hard to answer that. And yet this technology is already being used. And I think that's one of the biggest concerns is that for me, as I'm sure we'll come on to, is that I don't think we've got the evidence to say whether this is a good thing or not. And the fact there is this massive question mark over it makes me very worried that this AI technology is becoming part of lots of other things, even if we don't necessarily realize it.
Is this good for learning? And I know, obviously, we've read your article. This is an article talking about the threat posed by generative AI on the SMF, the Social Market Foundation website by Tom Richmond. Highly recommend it. It is a sobering read because I think, and correct me if this is a false summary, but I think your general thesis, Tom, is that we have not only not thought enough about whether AI is good for cognition and learning, but actually there are some quite serious risks that we are glossing over in our drive to hope that EdTech and AI prove to be a silver bullet for everything that's wrong with our education system.
Yeah, and when I talk to schools and trust leaders and parents and even universities about this, I always go back to the really basic principles of what we call the science of learning, which is quite a strange phrase to lots of people. What do you mean by the science of learning? Learning for many years was thought of as quite a mystical thing. It sort of happened to some kids and didn't happen to other kids, and that was fine. But actually, over the last 30, 40 years, we built up a pretty good understanding from education research, from neuroscience, from psychology. We built a pretty good understanding, not a perfect understanding, but a pretty good understanding of how we learn things. And by learning, I mean information that changes in your long-term memory, and so it sticks. And I think the best insight that I've heard someone use to describe the importance of the science of learning and how it works is that learning happens when you think hard. It's very hard to learn something unless you actively process the information that's in front of you. That is just a really simple insight that applies to not just children, young people, it applies to adults too. We need to think hard in order to learn.
And what do you mean actively processing? Can you break that down?
It really just means thinking about it. So it could be something you see, it could be something you taste, it could be something you hear, it doesn't matter, but you really have to pay attention to it and think about it. And that is the processing that you need to do. It doesn't have to last for hours. It can actually just be a few seconds. I've heard that sound. I've seen what's written on a piece of paper in front of me, and I think about it. Once I've seen it and I know it's there, I then think about it and I try and do something with that information. And that's the essence of learning. Learning happens when you think hard. And then you look at what these AI technologies, these large language models like ChatGPT, what do they do? Well, essentially what they're doing is shortcutting that entire process. Unlike technology we've seen in the past, which might help you do something, even Google doing it as a search engine, well, yeah, that makes things a bit quicker, but it doesn't stop you having to think. You still, even if you're going to write an essay using what's available on the Google search engine, you need to have to get that information and piece it together with that bit. And then I've got to write an introduction. I've got to do a conclusion. Or have I got enough sources? I've got to reference the sources. Maybe that source isn't actually very good. Maybe I should not use that. You have to at least think about it at some level. But what we're seeing with these large language models like ChatGPT is that the entire thought process has just been bypassed. It just goes round it. It goes, here's what I want to do at the start. Here's where I want to get to at the end. You tell me what you want me to produce as a chatbot and I'll produce it. So the whole learning process just comes to a halt. That doesn't matter what age you are. It applies to adults as much as it applies to children. But what's really worrying is when novices come across this technology. Because if you've got lots of expertise, I've been in education for over 20 years. I've taught for over 6 years. After 6 years of planning lessons, if you said to me, plan a lesson, I can plan it pretty easy because I've got that expertise already. But what if someone who doesn't have that expertise confronts a chatbot and then does no thinking? Well, that means the next time they have to do the same task, they missed an opportunity to learn the first time. They haven't acquired that knowledge. They haven't got that expertise. And that can go on and on and on and on. That process does not stop at any point of just missing a chance to learn again and again and again and again. And that's where my biggest concern about this technology arises, because we have inadvertently come across a situation where this technology can do almost all of the thinking for you. All the research that's been done shows it can produce pretty good essays, pretty good course. It might not be perfect, but given a choice of doing, spending hours and days and weeks and months on a piece of work, or just clicking a button and getting an answer in 15 seconds, we do have to assume that young people and children are going to be rational, and adults are going to be rational too. It's a very effective shortcut, but it means you don't learn. No knowledge, no expertise acquisition. That damages the learning process at its most fundamental level.
Tom, in your very interesting paper, you do acknowledge that there's some of the early research has been showing that when children use these types of tools, when they're exposed to AI, that I'm going to paraphrase here, but their results have got better in certain studies. How do you sort of explain that? How do we rationalize that research with what you're describing about this sort of idea of, I think you call it cognitive offloading, sort of becoming a bit lazy, a bit mentally reliant on AI, and so not storing that long-term memory?
This is, I think, for parents, this is going to be a huge deal now, because what's absolutely crucial to remember is that performance is not the same as learning. You can perform extremely well in a test and have learnt nothing before that test. So if you say, your teacher says, right, I've got a history essay to do for tomorrow, I can get ChatGPT to basically write that essay for me now, and I can perform well. I might get a good grade for that work. I have learnt nothing in the process. And that's why when, from a parent's perspective, when you see your child's marks being sent home, when you see the grade that your child got, when you see even an end of term test, when you see that piece of coursework, what mark they got, what we're now seeing is that those two things, performance and learning, are going to separate very, very quickly. Mm-hmm. So a student, to take an extreme example, it is now possible to cheat very easily with tools like ChatGPT on many forms of homework. Maths, science, history, geography, doesn't matter. These tools are incredibly powerful at least providing you with an answer, maybe sometimes even a good one. So when you're a parent looking at how well your child is performing, as in the grades they get in their work, it is now becoming increasingly less obvious that has any relationship to how much that child has learned. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, in some respects in England, we're quite lucky that we do have external exams at various points in our education system. Age 11, we have SATs, we have GCSEs at age 16 for a lot of kids, or almost all kids, and then a lot of people go and do A-levels afterwards as well. So even if somebody has really not been doing much work up to that point, they know there is a final test waiting for them. So you might be able to convince them that actually missing out on that learning is really not a good idea. There are other countries you actually don't have any external exams, so convincing them, those children, actually, it's a good idea to keep working, that learning really is valuable. You really need to understand what's going on, have that knowledge and gain that knowledge. It will be better for you. That will be a really difficult conversation, but at least that exam focus means that I hope, and it is nothing more than a hope, that a lot of students will realize, children and young people will realize that it is in their best interest to try and learn. But unfortunately, the performance of that pupil on any form of homework now is not going to be a reliable indicator of whether they're learning stuff.
Playing devil's advocate, why do we care? If we are, according to objective metrics, performing, does it matter if we're not learning, if we're not retaining the knowledge?
If you shortcut the learning process and you go, well, instead of thinking hard about it, I'm just going to get this tool, this AI tool, to produce it for me, that raises lots of really difficult questions.
Yeah. Well, and actually, can you talk us through, there's one very powerful experiment that was referenced both in your paper and I've seen referenced elsewhere, which was that pupils initially performed better after using the whichever AI tool it was, but then when you took the tool away, were very quickly shown to revert not only back to a base level, but below the level of the control group.
It is one of the most fascinating pieces of research that's been done so far. It was done on math students. It was a randomized controlled trial, as we called it, a very high quality study where they compared, they were doing practice maths problems in class, and they created 3 groups of students. So one group got access to essentially ChatGPT to help them solve their maths problems in class. Another group got access to an even better version of ChatGPT, which would give them slightly more power to do their maths problems in class. And then another group got no support from a chatbot at all. And you're right that when it came to how well did they perform in class, the students who got access to the chatbot were way better than the students who didn't get access to the chatbot. The students who got access to the souped up, the more powerful version of ChatGPT were 127% better at solving maths problems in class than their peers who did not get access to a chatbot.
And just to interrupt that, so the chatbot in that situation, presumably it's not just telling you the answers, because then everyone would get 100%.
Exactly, but it is basically, it can pretty much solve the problem.
Right.
These tools can solve the problem for you, even a maths problem. Now, if you punch in a maths problem, here's my maths problem, and you then, all the student does is have to write down the answer they want to tell the teacher they got. You don't really know how they got there, but that was exactly what the experiment was done today. So you've got the support whenever you want it of the chatbot, and they performed way better than their peers when they got access to it. But then it came to the final exam, and they took away the chatbots from all the students. So no student had access to a chatbot in the final exam. And they found that the students who had access to the chatbot during the practice maths problems, as you say, they ended up performing worse in their final exam than the students who'd never got access to a chatbot at all, the control group. And the way the authors described it was they described it as the students who had access to a chatbot using it as a crutch, a kind of a mental crutch. They were leaning on it. They were leaning on it. Rather than doing the thinking themselves, learning happens when you think hard. Rather than doing the thinking, they got the chatbot to do the thinking. Whereas the students who didn't have access to the chatbot, guess what? They had to keep thinking hard.
Yes.
And you know what? It wasn't fun for them. It's harder. That mental effort, we've all experienced it at our age. We know that having to think hard is effortful, and it's not always nice, and it takes time. It takes mental resources. We don't generally enjoy those things because it's quite a lot of pressure. It's quite a lot of pressure on our brain.
Yes.
And that is a beautiful illustration of the science of learning in action, and why generative AI technology can, if used in the wrong way, actually damage your learning. Rather than it being inconsequential, it can actually make your learning worse.
And I guess another way of looking at this sort of difference between performance and learning is thinking about the difference between teaching and learning, isn't it? And thinking about the officials and the Secretary of State, sat being presented with whatever decks they'll have seen about how these tools can help solve problems. You can see how quite a compelling case might be made that relying on or making use of the power of AI can solve a whole range of resource and capability issues in teaching, albeit as you're elegantly pointing out, doesn't necessarily and probably actually does the opposite in terms of solving for learning. Do you think that's a fair analogy? Trying to sort of rationalise what is it that the people in charge, the government, the DFE officials think they're solving for, and perhaps confusing teaching with learning?
There is no doubt from looking at the research evidence, as I did for my paper, that there is good experimental evidence to show that AI technology such as ChatGPT can make you more productive, is a word they often use. By that, they basically mean faster. So if I've got a given amount of work I have to do, I can generally do it faster if I use AI technology. That applies to teachers as much as it applies to pretty much any other professional. If I've got a lesson to plan, and I can sit there for maybe half an hour or an hour trying to design exactly the right worksheet, think about my timings, think about how I'm going to link it to the previous curriculum content, how am I going to link it to the next lesson, what do I need to cover, how am I going to design that activity, how am I going to get, is it going to be groups, is it going to be individual? You really have to think hard about it to do it well. And as new teachers, every new teacher makes a lot of mistakes, and that is all part of the learning process. You try something, you think it's going to help the students, it doesn't work, and then you go back and then try again, maybe the next term or the next year or next week or whatever it is. But it's all part of the learning process. When we think about the science of learning, it's absolutely essential we don't just think about it as learning for children. All of our brains work in the same way. This is about how do we get learning as the outcome. For new teachers, if you give them access to ChatGPT, they will probably plan lessons faster. That's exactly what's reported to me by the teachers themselves. It's what teacher training organizations tell me, that students are immediately, in large numbers, trainee teachers are using these tools straight away because it can do things faster. And teachers, a lot of them are parents themselves. They're very pressed for time. Who wouldn't want a teacher to do things faster? It seems like an obvious way.
These are success metrics. How quickly you can prepare a lesson, how well your children appear to perform. These are all measures by which schools and DFE officials, no doubt, are measured on their success.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got 5 lessons to plan tomorrow, you need to get through them as quickly as possible. In one evening, that is a tall order, even for an experienced teacher. So again, it's a rational response to say, is there something out there that can do this, help me do this quicker? But if you shortcut the learning process and you go, well, instead of thinking hard about it, I'm just going to get this tool, this AI tool, to produce it for me, that raises lots of really difficult questions. Firstly, is that trainee teacher particularly going to acquire any expertise about planning lessons if they just get the AI tool to do it for them? Almost certainly not. What impact does that have on the students? Well, probably quite a big impact in the long run. It will also have an impact on that teacher in the long run, because every time they miss out an opportunity to learn, they build their expertise of designing resources, designing lesson materials. That all requires you to think hard. And if you just don't acquire that expertise, where is that teacher going to be in 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 years' time? That's never really been the case before. That's not to say a member of staff couldn't borrow a worksheet from another member of staff. But as a one-off intervention in an isolated case, that's very different from saying, I'm just going to plan all my lessons using ChatGPT, which is where we might inadvertently be heading at the moment. And again, I'm not blaming people for wanting to be more productive. I'm not blaming the government for wanting to help teachers reduce their workload. But if we don't get back to what are we actually trying to do, which from my perspective is about build knowledge and expertise among everyone, if we lose sight of that, we can very quickly end up in a downward spiral where, frankly, lots of new professionals, teachers and in other sectors too, are just not building up their expertise. What impact that has on the pupils, I'm very, very worried about.
Well, I guess that segues actually quite nicely to my next question, which was going to be, playing devil's advocate, why do we care? So if we have got people, be that pupils or teachers or frankly anyone, I'm trying to write a novel at the moment. Almost impossible task, it turns out, but it's very tempting to think maybe I should just feed it into ChatGPT and see what it does to my plot. I'm sure it'd be much, much better. Haven't yet done that. But I guess, do we care? Why do we care? Does it, if we are, according to objective metrics, performing, does it matter if we're not learning, if we're not retaining the knowledge?
I mean, that really gets to the heart of what it means to be a great teacher. And this is a conversation which I'm glad that people are having more and more now. It's really forcing us to confront this question of, what is teaching just standing at the front and just parroting stuff? Is that really what we want for the children and young people sitting in front of them? And this is what the AI companies seem to be drifting towards. They think that if you sit a child in front of a tablet with an AI chatbot for math teaching, that the child will just learn stuff. They'll just sort of magically get from A to B, and there won't be any human interaction around them, and they'll be seen to be performing okay. And the teacher doesn't really need to do much teaching. They can sort of be there floating around the room, just helping the students with a bit of a nudge here and there. But I don't think anyone would really say that's what we want from education in its broader sense. If teaching is just, you are just delivering content from A to B, from person to another person, then yeah, AI could probably start doing more and more of that. It'll be able to do online lectures. You just need to deliver it, information from A to B. That's teaching all done.
Well, and for the pupils, again, if they are able to produce work, and again, this is, I know it's being devil's advocate, but why if their work looks okay, that whole fake it till you make it kind of thing, is it that big an issue if actually they're not internalizing what they're reading?
Yeah, and that goes right back to the science of learning. What we know pretty clearly from the research literature, and again, this is not a new finding, nothing to do with ChatGPT, this is just what we know about how humans learn, is that when we want to build knowledge and expertise, what is absolutely essential that we do is we bolt the new thing we want to learn onto something we already know. So you think about it as kind of like a network or like a spider diagram. We're always attaching new bits on. But the point is, if you don't have that core knowledge first, you've got nothing to attach the new information onto. And so the knowledge that you get, it doesn't really ever connect together. It means your learning outcomes are just far worse. And that means your expertise is worse, which means that ultimately, as we were saying earlier, once you remove that crutch for whatever reason, the person's just lost because they don't have that ability to think for themselves. So it's one of these bizarre parts of the AI debate is that we're hearing a lot of tech companies talk about critical thinking. We don't need knowledge. Who needs knowledge in this world? What we need to do is train people to think critically. That's the skill that in the AI-fueled 21st century we really need to worry about. But of course, all the experts in the education research field say, don't you understand what critical thinking is? It's being able to use the knowledge and expertise you have already in your head to interrogate something new. So if you never built up that knowledge and expertise and you just assume, oh, well, I can always Google it, so it'll all be fine, then unfortunately what that means is that the student, at whatever point in the future, be it in that lesson or maybe when they try and get a job and when they're in the workplace, if they've never built up that knowledge and expertise, they won't be able to think critically. And yet that is really the goal that we want for everybody. So this idea of knowledge being attached to existing knowledge as you build up that knowledge over and over and again, that is the sort of the best way to think about what learning is. It's not just isolated blobs of information from a geography lesson, from a maths lesson. It's actually the cumulative knowledge, and it all attaches to what we already know. And if you try and learn something which does not attach to what you already know, it's very, very difficult. So if you try to teach me something about quantum mechanics right now, it's not impossible for me to learn about it, but I have no real pre-existing knowledge which to bolt quantum mechanics onto. So it's really, really difficult for me to do that. Like I say, it doesn't mean I'm going to learn nothing, but it means the whole process of learning becomes worse.
Is it possible that a good AI is a better teacher than a poor quality teacher?
Honestly, I don't think there's a parent in the country that would want their child to be taught like that.
Ridiculous claims that some of the tech companies are making about how they're going to replace teachers. I mean, thankfully, there aren't many people who say this, but there is definitely a view out there in Silicon Valley that we can use these AI tools to just replace teachers. We don't need teachers. We need kids sitting in front of our software, and the software will do their teaching.
Let me pose another sort of slightly unfairly tricky question, I suppose, but it's the levelling up argument, right? So it's very easy to fall into a trap of thinking that what we're comparing here is a best-in-class human teacher with a best-in-class AI. But the reality is that there's a huge divergence across the country in the quality of teaching that children receive from teachers, and that's just how it is. Is it possible that a good AI is a better teacher than a poor quality teacher?
I think that's a brilliant question. And you mentioned that there's variation across the country. I take it probably a step further than that and say there's variation across the world. And there's not only variation across the world in teaching quality, there's variation across the world in terms of whether people even have a teacher at all or even have a school. And I think when you look at it like that, when you're talking about learning, am I going to get better learning out of doing whatever I'm going to do? For example, the Department for Education has just announced a big trial of AI tutoring. So they've just put, see if my notes is it, they're going to try and get tutoring to 450,000 disadvantaged kids using AI-powered tutoring rather than necessarily face-to-face tutoring. And we've got very good evidence that high-quality face-to-face tutoring really works. It's expensive, but it really helps disadvantaged kids a lot. The government obviously want that to see if they can replicate that through AI tutoring. So if you're comparing the AI tutors they're going to develop over the next couple of years, if you're comparing that to high-quality face-to-face tutoring, the chances are it's never going to be as good. And I think that's probably a reasonable starting point to assume, unless proven otherwise, which I might well be wrong, but I think our starting point should be it's probably never going to be as good as the very best face-to-face teachers or tutors.
Yep.
But if I've got a country somewhere in the world where they don't even have access to a teacher at all, the teacher never turns up, or they haven't even got a classroom, and you said, I've got this AI tutoring tool, will this be a good thing? I'm much more inclined to say the learning will be better with that AI tutoring tool than it will be with nothing at all. And I think it really does depend on what your frame of reference is. We know money is tight in government right now. I think it's very sensible then to be piloting and trialing some of these things to see if they can get some progress. If there is a school, for whatever reason, just cannot get a maths teacher and a pretty good AI tutoring tool is available, I think it would be crazy not to trial that and see if we can make that work. But again, I think that some of the ridiculous claims that some of the tech companies are making about how they're going to replace teachers. I mean, thankfully, there aren't many people who say this, but there is definitely a view out there in Silicon Valley that we can use these AI tools to just replace teachers. We don't need teachers. We need kids sitting in front of our software, and the software will do their teaching. That I really get very uncomfortable about, not just because there's no research evidence to show it's true. But I think it's using the wrong frame of reference that we know great teaching and learning can happen with face-to-face tutoring and teaching. Why would we not focus on that relentlessly? And if we need to use other tools in other circumstances, fine, let's absolutely have that conversation.
Well, and is one of the issues here that certainly the way that some of these schemes, these AI-driven schemes, are being envisaged in the UK, it is not so much to fill a gap in teacher availability, although I guess that might be coming, but it's targeted specifically at certain pupils, isn't it? So just a few months ago, obviously, D&E announced this targeted AI tutoring scheme for disadvantaged pupils. And I guess a similar question applies there. Like, is it legitimate to say there are some pupils for whom, whether it is because they are from particular backgrounds or whether because perhaps they have particular issues, disabilities, SEND issues, for example, they are likely to be more appropriate beneficiaries of AI or AI tutoring? Is that reasonable or is that misguided?
It's a great question to ask, and that's exactly the kind of question that the government is, I think, rightly starting to ask with some of the trials and the pilots they're setting up. It is possible that's where we might end up. I don't think that's unrealistic at all to say, look, for the vast majority of pupils, high quality face-to-face teaching and learning should absolutely be the default that we should be aiming for. It's not easy to deliver, as you were saying, but we should be aiming for that. However, maybe students with particular disabilities, and maybe not even just people with SEND, maybe very specific types of special needs.
Because I think we need to be careful with that, don't we? Because I think certainly from our parent group, we get an awful lot of parents of SEND kids. I mean, in some ways, they're the most vehement opposition, actually, to the technology, saying we do not, the iPads, whatever it is, smartphones, iPads, EdTech, this makes our child's issue so much worse than it was before.
Yeah, exactly. And this is why if we just say we're going to let 1,000 flowers bloom and just sort of see what happens, I don't feel that's the right approach at all. I think the government is rightly trying to sort of narrow our scope a little bit and saying, let's focus on particular problems and let's test it very carefully, very sensibly with all the safeguards in place. Let's see if we can improve learning. And if we can't, we should just say no. And I think that's where I think the tech companies just have a completely different worldview. They just think that this is the answer. They talk a lot about personalized learning. So this is one of the biggest things they think is should be the direction of travel for education, that we should have every child sitting in front of a laptop or a tablet, and the software will be personalized to them, and the learning will be personalized to them, and that will be better. But again, I think that's a bit of a bleak view of education. I think that when we talk about education, the social and emotional aspects of education, which you lose if you have every child staring at a tablet, that's probably even more of a concern for parents with special needs people, because they want them to be able to flourish and to thrive at school and in life and work as well. And if we set our goals of saying we just need to work out the bit of software that works for them, I just get very uncomfortable about that, because I don't think we should lose that human element to it with the expert teacher.
Honestly, I don't think there's a parent in the country that would want their child to be taught like that. So, but if that is, maybe they can find us and tell us why. It'd be an interesting conversation. But I guess you mentioned safeguards. That seems like quite an important concept, I think, in this conversation, because I guess we are assuming here that it is possible to teach children through technology and AI-powered technology, and for there to be safeguards that work. Do we know, are there safeguards that work? Because again, coming at it from the point of view of, the kind of having the benefit of what parents are telling us, we just have a litany, don't we, of issues being reported, either about EdTech and the use of EdTech platforms, or actually more widely, or more particularly maybe the infiltration of unsuitable AI and what that AI can be asked to do, what it's doing, the kind of intrusion of that into our kids' lives.
We're seeing a little bit of progress from the government on this. I'm very glad at the start of this year they released what they called some product standards, which were for the AI tool developers themselves. And their government's trying to set out, this is what we want from these AI products. Just to give you some examples of this. So these standards, they said, that generative AI tools, things like ChatGPT, for example, they must protect children's mental health. They must filter out harmful content. They must avoid any impact on the emotional and social development of children. They must protect children from manipulation. They must avoid exploitation, so trying to sort of trick them into interacting with them. They should also detect signs of learner distress, such as mentions of self-harm.
That all sounds very good on paper.
It does.
It's a wish list.
But is any of it, what was the first one? Protect children's mental health. Well, how is ChatGPT? I mean, from watching how my children have started using ChatGPT, if left to their own devices, I would hesitate to suggest it's doing anything to protect their mental health.
When you're talking about product standards, these are aspirational at the moment, and I don't think they are anything more. That doesn't mean to say they will only ever be aspirational. It is not impossible that we will see the government start to introduce slightly tougher standards in the future, but a lot of these tools are already out there. They haven't necessarily been tested at all. The companies that are pushing some of these more visible products, such as Google, these are multi-billion-dollar organizations. They're not based in the UK. So it's not clear, again, how that whole dynamic would work if Google or X, Elon Musk's company, if they designed a product, do they have to pay attention? And what happens if they don't pay attention? What sanctions, if any, would there be? That whole dynamic is unexplored yet. And I think that's where I'm still concerned, is that having the standards of what we want the tools to do, or not to do, as the case may be, is good. But unless we make sure that that's not going to happen, and I think that bad things aren't going to happen, and we actually start, I don't know whether it's a sort of a licensing model or a registration model, whatever it is, that there is a bit of a concern that a horse may have bolted on some of these things. So I'm glad the government has opened the conversation, but at the moment we have very little evidence about the impact of these tools on children and young people. We know from some of the horrendous stories coming out of the US that already children committing suicide after using these tools. This is very, very serious stuff. And I'm concerned that the government is only now starting to think about standards, which themselves aren't yet enforceable anyway. Leaving it up to head teachers and teachers, I think, is just too much of an ask. I really don't think they've got the expertise. They don't have the time to pour through all the research that a company would produce. We're starting to see a few bodies like the Chartered College of Teaching, kind of a bit like the professional body for teachers. They're starting to do some work around creating an EdTech evidence board, so we can start to encourage the companies to come forward and show that their products work before. So it might be a kite marking scheme, maybe, so only certain products get a kite mark. But again, that doesn't mean to say we're not going to have harmful tools.
Well, and do we know, and sorry, we should probably know the answer to this, but who, in that situation, who designs the kite mark? Because really what you would want there, and we're talking about something, we have been talking about something similar in the realm of smartphones and that whole conversation, where actually the ideal would be to move towards a child safe or appropriate product that has been independently kite marked by someone who is acting in the best interests of children, not tech companies, not even teachers, children. And surely you would want something similar here, where these products have been independently kite marked as appropriate for children by someone who cares about children.
Yes. And I should say, when we talk about, you mentioned the EdTech Evidence Board, it's an interesting, relatively recently formed, isn't it? And if I'm right in remembering, I think it's got 16 or 17 members, or at least it did when it was formed, of whom all but one, I think, had careers in the technology industry. And so, we ask ourselves, without any aspersions to, the individuals involved, but we ask ourselves, can that really be perceived as any sort of independent body that should be making decisions about the standards of technology that's going to be deployed across our school estate?
I think that the really difficult thing for government, which applies beyond AI into other forms of educational technology, is that we've now got a school system where a lot of state schools are relatively independent. So we now, some of your listeners may be familiar with academy schools. These are essentially schools which are run as part of charitable trusts. They're not part of local government at all. And they've broadly got quite a lot of freedom to determine who they recruit and what their curriculum looks like. They've got more flexibility than other schools do. The point being that they can really decide what technology products they want to buy, irrespective of what the government is saying. So even if the government, maybe the EdTech Evidence Board becomes more rigorous, maybe the product safety standards that the government's designing, maybe they get a bit more teeth later down the line, it's still not clear how involved the government really can be in the individual purchasing decisions of a school or a school trust. And there are some examples in the past where the government has said, this is what we consider acceptable. You're going to have to buy from our approved list. So for things like phonics, for example, teaching young children how to read, the government has set out very clearly the list of products that meet the standards that they consider acceptable, and you have to use one of those. And that is the model which I'm quite attracted to when it comes to a lot of these new technologies that are coming online through AI. For the government to say, we are only going to allow these things into schools if we have assured ourselves collectively, with the government's expertise and probably some external expertise coming in as well, that these tools are safe and effective. But we're not there at the moment at all. We really are still, schools and trusts make decisions. It's worth bearing in mind, they make independent decisions about pretty much everything they want to buy. The government just doesn't get involved in these things. So for the government to impose itself in which forms of technology you can buy is tricky. It's not impossible, but it's going to be a bit awkward when they try and do it. But I think given what's at stake here, not just in terms of the learning outcomes, which I'm very, very concerned about, but the safety issues as well and the safeguarding points. I mean, again, some of the stories we're seeing about what kids can get access to and the things that these chatbots are saying to them. There's some amazing stories in the news recently, aren't there, about some toys that have got AI in them as well and are blurting out some horrendously inappropriate things to young children. But for some reason, these things are still available for sale. And I don't understand how we've got into that situation and not had some kind of response from government. So I think a lot of people realise that it's only government that can solve this. And I don't mean to sound all big brother about that. I mean, I genuinely think the scale of the task that needs to be delivered here in terms of safety and security and making sure that kids are safe when they're using these tools, I don't think anyone's got the clout apart from government to say, this is how it's going to go, and make sure that everybody is agreed on what the standards are. And if you don't meet those standards, you're not going into schools with your product. And that would be very different from what we've seen with education technology in the past, where it really has been a bit of a free-for-all.
Yes. And I mean, in a sense, what that highlights is that where we're at the moment is in the middle of some giant AI experiment, isn't it? I mean, we, as you said, we still don't know very much about effectiveness. We know for sure that there are safety and safeguarding issues because parents and teachers on the front line report them.
As you say, it all comes down to how we use the technology. But I don't think we can trust the tech companies to decide what's best.
And presumably there will be long-term implications of that. I mean, I know this research is relatively new.
It's not going to happen by itself. I'm absolutely convinced that if we just allow the free-for-all to continue that we have now, we can end up in some very, very bad places.
That we know about what's being reported, but there is an argument about the ethics of this, really, isn't there? And this idea that this is a big uncontrolled experiment on our kids, and usually we don't do that. We say we don't run uncontrolled experiments on kids, and if there are prima facie concerns about harm, we would want to be very sure that a product was safe before it is rolled out further. And it seems that what we're doing here is, we've rolled out the product, and now in a very slow and haphazard way, we're letting concerns and evidence about the efficacy and safety of that product filter down. And then, in a few years, we may or may not decide to do something about it. And I don't know if you'd agree with that, if you think that's too extreme.
Yeah, no, I don't at all. I think if we look at the smartphone debate, I think it's a very, very useful parallel. We are now getting to the point where most schools have some kind of curbs in place. I don't think those curbs are strong enough personally, but that's probably a whole separate podcast we could do some other time on that. But I think there is at least a recognition of a problem.
Yes.
And until you get to the recognition of a problem, you can't start putting solutions in place. It's taken us, when was the first iPhone released? Early 2010s, maybe late
2012, I think.
Yeah, so we're talking about 15 years before we collectively went, this is not good. And I'm glad that we've said that it's not good, but it shouldn't have taken us this long to get there. And I'm looking at where we are with generative AI. I don't want us to wait 15 years from launch of ChatGPT, which would be 2037 since ChatGPT came out, before we go, this stuff is actually pretty harmful. We need to place some restrictions on that.
Well, and can't we see the harm? Am I right in saying we can see the harm on brain scans?
Yeah, I mean, they quite literally scanned people's brains while they were using ChatGPT. I think the study was called something like "Your Brain on ChatGPT." They were not subtle about it. That's literally what they did. So they gave an essay writing task to I think 54 students. They split them into different groups, and they watched what happened in their brains while they were writing the essays. And I think they compared students who were using a large language model, an LLM, to students who were just using a search engine, but not an LLM, so like a Google search engine, and then compared them to students who didn't get access to either a search engine or a large language model. And they just watched their brains when they were doing the essay writing task, and they found that the greatest brain activation was found in the students who had access to no external support. Learning happens when you think hard. The least amount of brain activity was found in the LLM group. It was very clear from the brain scans. They did lots of different parts of the study to try and work out what was going on. My favorite bit of the study was, because it was an essay writing task, what they got to do as part of the method was ask students to recall the essay that they wrote. So they produced an essay using an LLM or a search engine, or just with their own, they call them the brain-only group, which is a wonderful, wonderful name. And they asked them to just quote their own essay.
Yeah.
On the first test session when they did this, the students who used the large language model to write their essay, not a single one of those students could quote the essay that they had written with the large language model.
Wow.
Their brain was just depowered so much that they couldn't even remember what they wrote. And of course, if you use an LLM to write an essay, you'll know this experience. It just does the work for you. You kind of look at it and you review it, maybe.
But you've moved on now.
You've moved on mentally. So the essay is there, but all you've done is sort of give it a scan and say, well, that looks about right, and you're done. It's just depowering your brain because you're not thinking hard. And they literally could not quote their own essay. I mean, it was quite remarkable. That is the scale of the brain challenge we are talking about here. It just completely bypasses the thinking and learning process.
And presumably there will be long-term implications of that. I mean, I know this research is relatively new, but if you persistently don't use your brain for certain tasks,
it just gets worse and worse. That's the thing. It's not just a one-off thing. Again, if someone with 20 or 30 years experience uses a ChatGPT on a one-off basis, the science of learning would say it's not a problem. It's really not a problem. As I was saying earlier, what I worry about is the novices, novice adults, novice young people, novice children, and they use a technology that's pretty catastrophic for their learning. And that just then means that all their future learning experiences will be worse off because they've missed those learning experiences earlier on.
I mean, I don't think we'll have time to cover it today, but actually it strikes me as a particular issue with adolescence and that kind of very, the brain development stage that most of these kids will be at with their first real touch point of AI and these kind of very powerful tools comes at just the wrong time, you would have thought, in terms of brain development. But maybe that's one for another.
Yeah. Well, again, I see parallels to the smartphone debate.
If
we let the damage happen at probably the most crucial point in someone's life when it comes to the speed of brain development, certainly there's a huge amount going on at the very least. It's once that has happened, it's not, it's not impossible that we might be able to retrieve the situation later on, but it's made it an awful lot worse.
And I think it's why, we've always felt for that very reason that it's so important that the smartphones and social media are resisted for kids up to the age of 16. It's not 13, it's not 14. Yeah. At the very least, I think we might have started higher, but but it's certainly not 13, 14 or 15. But I think probably getting to the end of time. One more question?
Yeah, well, we should maybe sort of ask ourselves whether there's any cause to be optimistic here. Can you conceive of a scenario, a world in which we get this right, and in some manner, some respect, learning can be improved by the thoughtful use of AI in education? Or actually, should we be resisting it at all costs forever?
I think there is room to be optimistic about this. I think that's why saying don't let this technology anywhere near schools, hospitals, workplaces, I think that's completely the wrong approach, because I don't want this to be used as a shortcut to the learning process. I don't want people to go, I can do it faster, therefore I should use AI. That's a bad place for us to be. But if I can use it in a way that enhances people's expertise, I think that's where I can get some really. And I think when people are thinking about trainee teachers, lots of other professions, trainee doctors, nurses, lawyers, accountants, whatever these professions are, if they use it cleverly, this technology I think can be immensely powerful. What worries me is when they say, I'm just going to fire all my junior staff and I'm just going to use AI to do the work for them. No learning takes place because no one's thinking hard anymore. You can keep hold of thinking hard and use AI as a second opinion. I think we get to some very exciting places in healthcare and education and beyond. So that's why I'm I'm clinging to that optimism.
Yes, yeah.
I think that's going to require a lot of willpower from a lot of people to make sure we stay on that path.
Yeah.
Because at the moment, it's just, I can do this quicker, I'm going to go and do it instead.
And it will require some very thoughtful curation by teachers as well, won't it? To resist the inevitable urge to take the shortcut. And so in some ways you'd say this is it's a positive future because it relies so much on teachers being well trained to be able to use it. It puts teachers at the heart of the learning process again.
It does. So if a teacher planned their lesson and then got AI to say, here's a second opinion on your lesson, that's completely different from the teacher saying, just get AI to plan the work for me. What worries me slightly is that some people at the top of a lot of professions might see AI as a way to
Yes.
not recruit staff, to de-skill their junior staff and recruit fewer of them, not realizing that if those junior staff that you have recruited, very few numbers of them, don't have that knowledge and expertise, that again, you fast forward 3, 5, 10 years, I'm really interested in where that profession is going to find itself. And I don't think it's a very good place. The people at the top of the profession got there by thinking hard. And if we ever lose sight of that, then I don't really know where lots of professions end up, because we'll de-skill doctors and lawyers and teachers. And I think it'll be a very bad place for everyone. So like I say, I think there's, as you say, it all comes down to how we use the technology. But I don't think we can trust the tech companies to decide what's best.
Yeah.
I think we need the professions to be very clear about what they want. I think we need government to be very clear about what they want and to impose that and not allow anybody else to say, I think this looks good or not. And maybe we can get some good outcomes. But like you say, it's not going to happen by itself. I'm absolutely convinced if we just allow the free-for-all to continue that we have now, we can end up in some very, very bad places in the workplace, in education, and in lots of other sectors too. So I'm sort of quietly optimistic, but it's definitely not going to happen by itself.
All right. Well, on that note, Tom, thank you very much for joining us. I think that's a really interesting conversation, and I'm sure we will be speaking to you lots more over the weeks and months ahead.
I look forward to it. Thank you for the invitation again. It's been great.
It's a pleasure.